Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Tenpenny Files. I'm your host, Dr. Sherri Tenpenny. The Tenpenny Files has daily conversations meant to inform and educate, not just to entertain. I come prepared and let the discussion unfold naturally with people worth hearing on topics worth exploring. If it matters to your body, your freedom, or your future, we talk about it here. Each day, I talk with authors, documentary filmmakers, and independent thinkers whose work challenges mainstream messaging. We cover a wide range of topics here, so there's something for everyone. We talk about government, politics, and history, to astronomy, pets and travel, food, farming and fitness, vaccines, health, and health policy. And once a week, we have conversations with authors who write about faith and biblical principles. The goal is to introduce you to topics that you've never heard of or topics that you always wish you'd had time to explore, but you didn't know where to begin. Let our authors show the way. So join me here daily, Monday through Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern on the Tenpenny Files, as we hear from voices that have often been ignored, silenced, or censored, but truly have something important to say. But before we begin this episode, I just want to invite all of our listeners and watchers to please become a Tenpenny Prime member. Prime members receive exclusive monthly white paper, a recorded presentation, and access to a monthly Ask the Expert masterclass. To learn more and hopefully to join us and support our show, go to primemembership.drtenpenny.com to learn more and come along and join us. We have a lot of fun in that membership. So now let's get started. Today's conversation is with nonfiction author who has a lifelong interest in medical history and forensic medicine, John Leake, to talk about his book, co-authored with Dr. Peter McCullough, Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality, that tells the story of this technology in the celebrated men who were biased by religious faith, wishful thinking, ideology, and a desire for recognition and money. John, welcome so much to the Tenpenny Files. It is my absolute honor to have you here with me today.
Thank you, doctor. Thanks for having me.
You know, in writing The Courage to Face COVID-19, and as time has gone on since the pandemic, what interested you in writing about the story of early vaccine developers?
Well, my co-author, Dr. Peter McCullough, and I, we didn't really know much, if anything. I mean, you've been doing this, you've been in this game for a long, long time. We were both kind of naive about what exactly this history of vaccines, what is it? Where did man fall in love with this technology and how did it develop over time? It was really only with the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccines that prompted us to ask, well, I mean, all of this weird, bizarre assertions that are being made about this new generation of messenger RNA COVID-19 vaccines, like what else have these guys not been telling us, or rather, what distorted assertions have we been told about the vaccine enterprise altogether? And it was really, that prompted us to go and look at authors like you, look at authors, Roman, how do you pronounce his name? Bistrianik, I believe is, and uh, yeah, Sherri, I've kind of lost your audio again. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me now?
Okay, yeah, you cut out there. Some of these previous authors who had looked at the entirety of the vaccine enterprise going back to the 18th century, and so we got curious about it, and we read a lot of this literature, and I am a nonfiction author. I'm kind of a practitioner of what we call narrative nonfiction, where you look at all of the facts of a story, in this case, a long historical series of episodes going back for 300 years. You look at the key characters in it, and then you try to tell the story of this. So our book it's a critical evaluation of the entire vaccine enterprise, but it told in a what we hope is a gripping narrative with character development and an exposition of the motives and the hopes and the aspirations, going all the way back to the 18th century. I think it's a grand intellectual adventure with a lot of the foibles and shortcomings of the human mind. I mean, there are elements of great insight and genius, but there are also a lot of elements of vanity and fraud and hubris and all of the other stuff that we're stuck with our human nature and our human condition.
What I found really interesting was your research of where you found a lot of the character of these characters, and where you found what they really did, who they reported to, how much they got paid. I just felt like the in-depth research into the character development of true persons. This isn't fiction, real persons was really interesting. Because years ago, I used to do a short presentation it was called Vaccine Developers, Heroes or Villains. And mine was barely skimming across the surface compared to what you've uncovered in your book. Where did you do most of your research to find that information?
Well, if it had been 20 years ago, it would have been very difficult because I would have had to have gone and grubbed around in archives at Harvard University or the Royal Society in London. But now there's so much literature going back hundreds of years, that has been digitally reproduced and is available online. I mean, I could find so many writings, Jenner's pamphlets, what other guys said about Jenner's original biography in 1820, I believe it was published. You can find it all digitally now. It's remarkable. I mean, the internet is so full of garbage, and a lot of it is distracting, but for scholarship, it's just astonishing. It really is. You can find so much historic literature digitally available now.
There's, a lot of that. If you go to archive.org for the listeners, they have whole books from the 1800s,
Yeah,
kinds of things
yeah.
there. What were some of the most surprising things? I know that this is a relatively new industry to you. I met when you and Peter were first working on your first book, and it was kind of at the beginning of COVID, and had a lot of conversations with Peter, some with you, but more with Peter. And this is, like you said at the beginning, kind of a new venture in terms of digging into it. As you were digging through these historical characters, what were some of the most surprising things that you found?
Well, just how much of it, the evaluation, starting with smallpox inoculation in the 18th century, and then getting into Jenner's smallpox vaccine, and then particularly the character of Louis Pasteur. I grew up reading medical history, and Pasteur was kind of a childhood hero. I mean, I read all of the laudatory literature on Pasteur when I was a boy. I didn't know at the time that there's a whole critical literature on Pasteur, and he was a man of great ambition. And if something or someone got in the way of his ambition, he was pretty darned ruthless about borrowing ideas that weren't his and not giving credit, overstating the efficacy and his results. I didn't realize until I read a book published in 1995 by a Princeton University medical historian that Pasteur had never made his lab notebooks available. He would go to the French Academy of Science and just proclaim, I have found a vaccine to fowl cholera. It works. And they'd say, oh, bravo, Professor Pasteur. It's like, well, can you show that it works? And then, he then would be off to his anthrax vaccine, which he also concealed a very key element in how exactly he made the anthrax vaccine. And then when it came to mass producing the anthrax vaccine, I'm speaking about for livestock, he didn't file a patent in order to present to the world his manufacturing technique. He just claimed only the Institute Pasteur possesses the understanding, so only the Institut Pasteur is in a position to make it. So it's just kind of like, I know how to do this, we'll deliver the product to farmers and jurisdictions all over the world, but we're not going to tell you how we're making it. So a lot of the vaccine enterprise going back to the 18th century, then going through Pasteur, and then coming up to the late 19th century, a lot of it is just not transparent. And a lot of the evaluations that are being done are really not, do not meet high scientific standards. Now, the other thing that you observed long ago is that mankind fell in love with the idea of inoculation in the 18th century long before living standards really started to improve. So there was this lag between the Royal Society, Cotton Mather, and Massachusetts Bay Colony falling in love with smallpox inoculation in the early 18th century. You don't really get this rapid and dramatic elevation of living standards till 150 years later. I'm talking about proper sewage, clean water, abundant food, even for the urban poor, proper housing with proper ventilation and winter heating for the winter, excuse me, winter heating for the urban poor. I mean, these elevations of the standard of living, they really come on at the end of the 19th century, right as the whole scientific crowd is deepening its love affair with vaccines and trying to introduce vaccines for everything on earth. We have this radical elevation of living standards. I believe the evidence shows clearly that it's the elevation of living standards that is reducing infectious disease mortality, but it's the vaccines that get the credit for it. It's classic misattribution.
Yeah, 100%. There was an article that was published in 2004. I've quoted it a lot over the years. And the article came out of two researchers from Harvard. It was about a 14-page paper, and they concluded unequivocally that it was clean water, sanitary water, that reduced typhoid, cholera, measles, smallpox, all these other things. And it really had little to nothing to do with the vaccines. And, so that was in 2004 when that paper was published. So roll that forward 20 years. Why is it still that we credit all of this, the saving grace, savior of the population to poisoning people with poison? Because I stopped John about, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago. I decided I was going to quit calling it quit talking about the pediatric vaccination schedule and call it what it was, which is the pediatric poisoning program and the adult assault agenda, because that's exactly what we are. With clean water, sanitation, better food, organic food. Now with Secretary Kennedy, all the big focus that he has on eat real food and clean. The water's been clean. We're trying to clean up the air. Do you think, because we run in the same circles, we know a lot of the same people. Do you think that the truth is coming out about kind of the scam of vaccines, the way that it's been a 200-year multi-generational indoctrination, and like Aaron Siri says in his book, a religion more than science? Are people really going to grasp on this, and are we going to get away from this poisoning program?
I think I think it's hard for people to grasp this. I mean, I agree with Aaron Siri. In fact, we just recorded an interview. We too talk about the religious elements of this. This is actually a Vatican coin, 20 euro silver coin commemorating the COVID-19 vaccine. And it's presented in this very religious iconography. And the Numista catalog, of the Vatican meant, it says, a boy is preparing to receive the vaccine, kind of like a boy preparing to receive the Eucharist. So there's this reverence and almost worship of vaccines as a savior and a liberator of mankind. That's very powerful, archetypal propaganda. And I think it's now very, very deep, particularly in the minds of the medical profession. I think the conversation that we're having right now, if you were to record it and to present it to students in medical school right now who have been indoctrinated in the religion of vaccines, I think they'd think we were crazy. So I think it's an incremental awakening in the public, but I think it could take a long time. I mean, the key points that I would point out, so I agree with the analysis that clean water, proper sewage channelization away from the city, clean water supplies. I mean, that was huge for typhoid and typhoid was one of the big waterborne, and then cholera. But even maybe even more importantly, is cleaning up the air. Remember, London used to be, they called it London fog. There was so much coal smoke in the air in London that you could scarcely see down the street. So many people had a low grade case of bronchitis just going all the time. And then amongst the urban poor, these tenement buildings in which the urban working poor, remember, this is the Industrial Revolution, when you have this urbanization. I mean, you just wouldn't believe the conditions in which the urban poor lived. It's just stunning. And then they didn't have proper heating in the winter. But then perhaps even the biggest one of all is nutrition. I mean, we read Charles Dickens and we see that Tiny Tim had rickets, extreme vitamin D deficiency. And so, one thing that we look at closely in our book is that a well-nourished body is pretty robust. But if you have an undernourished body or a malnourished body without the proper vitamin profile, particularly vitamin D and vitamin C, and vitamin A for smallpox, and actually vitamin A is important for a number of measles as well. Um, Once that vitamin nutrition profile generally improves, you see people becoming way, way more robust, way less susceptible to infectious diseases. So I think that's what people, need to understand. But again, vaccines get all the credit, and I think it's because they're high tech. There are these sort of miracles of scientific and technological, ingenuity. People went to school and studied all of this stuff for years. So, to say, well, you know, clean water and good food. Well, there's no real industry around that. I mean, maybe there's a better industry around better food, but or let's have sewers. It's like, well, although you see in Washington, D.C., that they can't maintain their sewer, which I think is just stunning. But anyway, there's no real lobby, there's no real interest group, there's no real industry between these generalized standard of living improvements. They're things that we all take for granted now.
Another thing that I don't think that most people realize, you talk about all of the stuff that happened in the UK, the honey bucket pots, the really poor sanitation, the fog, all these different things. But even right here in the United States, because I wrote about it in my book, Zero Accountability, is that even as late as the late 1800s here in the US, which was not that long ago, that there was a public health report that I quoted out of New York City that they dragged, almost 2 tons of dead animal carcasses out of the streets in an annual year because of the dead and putrid things. And the people living in the tenement houses were eating food full of maggots and didn't have any sanitation. There was no such thing as running water and flush toilets. just a mere 200 years ago in this country. And they started putting chlorine in the water in about the 1940s, which stopped typhoid and cholera in its tracks. And then, they diminished that amount. So it's everywhere, that sanitation all over the world, and plumbing. And I've often said that one of the wonders of humanity, of moving us forward, yes, clean water, better food, better hygiene, but electricity, where people could store their food, and their food that they had wouldn't be, turned into maggots, and I think that that is an element that's kind of underplayed. We don't talk
For
about.
sure. Absolutely. Yeah. And Cherry, in terms of infant and early childhood death, this is really, although it's interesting because Pasteur, what we call pasteurization, Pasteur had originally come up with the technique for preserving beer and wine. It was a tailored approach to beer and wine preservation. It was actually a German agriculturalist, probably 30 years later, Franz von Soxhlet was his name, who said, "Well, no, wait a minute. Like we could do Professor Pasteur's procedure with beer and wine. We could do it with milk, and it will make milk safer to drink." Now, I know that we have in our era of far higher technology, we have people that like raw milk, and it's great. But remember, back in the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, you had these swill milk dairies like in the cities with just absolutely appalling hygiene. And, mothers that were not producing enough milk to nurse their infants, and I'm speaking of the urban poor, they'd go to these swill milk dairies and they would purchase this incredibly filthy milk. And there have been studies done on it. I mean, just bovine tuberculosis, brucellosis. I mean, just every nasty thing. Um, uh, um, Various, forms of staphylococcal and streptococcus bacteria. And so, this so-called diarrhea of infancy was just rampant. So many children died of this. And proper pasteurization, again, just a hygienic measure, was enormously successful in reducing that. So, we get to 1948 when when the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends this childhood vaccine schedule with diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. I mean, already by 48, you've seen childhood mortality from all of these infectious diseases. It's already down 90%, even before the schedule was introduced. So, I think that what the world really needs to consider now is that could it be in our era of hyper vaccination of kids, particularly after the passage of the 1986 Childhood Vaccine Entry Act granting liability protection to the manufacturers, not only, not only for this handful of vaccines that were on the market then, but it granted them in perpetuity for all additional vaccines that were produced, going forward. So we have this era of hyper vaccination. The thing that I'm concerned about is that with the exception of small populations like the Amish, we don't have a proper control group to understand, like, well, what would happen to American children if they all weren't getting, a gazillion shots? Like, what would their health be like in the in our current ecological environment of clean water and better hygiene and better food? We don't know what American children would be like in our more wholesome era without vaccines. It's like this mass experimentation on all of humanity, or at least all of American humanity. And you see things like this terrifying spike of autism. And it's just not enough for our federal health agency officials to say, well, We don't know what's causing the rapid rise of autism. We just know it's not vaccines. Well, that's not going to cut it.
Well, it's
So,
not in this day and age when people are questioning. You know, to me, it's like we don't know what it's causing it, but we're not going to talk about the pink elephant in the living room that
right.
ignore that whole thing. You know, we're not going to look at that at all. And I do believe that there are studies out there that look at completely unvaccinated people. Brian Hooker's book, Vax Unvax, Let the Science Speak, they looked at 62 studies that had a control group of completely unvaccinated kids. You know, the backstory behind that is that Bobby Kennedy, when Bobby was still at Children's Health Defense, had called Brian and said, you know, there's got to be a couple studies out there that have a unvaccinated population as a control group. Why don't you see if you can find any? And Brian told me personally, he snickered and kind of laughed. He said, well, that ought to be a Saturday afternoon, because he didn't think he'd find anything. And the further they looked and the further they dug, they found, I believe it's 64 studies. And that book is compiled into, it's a series of graphs that compares the health of vaccinated to unvaccinated children on things like ear infections, asthma, Guillain-Barré, epilepsy, and things like that. And unequivocally, in every single graph, the unvaccinated children's health far supersedes the vaccinated children, every single one. And when I had Brian on the show and we talked about his book, the book's name is Vax Unvax, Let the Science Speak. I said, he said the book was created as a manual that parents could take it into the doctor's office and just flip by pages at a time and show when a yellow and a green graph side by side and showing the health of unvaccinated children. So we do have at least smaller studies of that beyond just people in autism that show that unhealthy children are far healthier than vaccinated children.
Yes, yes, and indeed, and Del Bigtree's got his new film out, "An Inconvenient Truth," in which a very distinguished doctor at Henry Ford in Michigan does just such a study. But we're always told, well, it was kind of a small control group. It wasn't. We're always sort of led to believe that the population study is too small. And that's obviously by design. It's I mean, we saw it during the COVID-19. The most terrifying thing, it would seem, for the guys that were rolling this out with such reckless abandon was a large control group. It was almost like, we want to get everybody vaccinated as soon as we possibly can, exerting, all the pressure in the world to achieve that. And it kind of feels like, well, you guys don't really want a control group, do you?
Fine. Well, John, hold that thought right there. We need to take a quick break here from our sponsors. This is a good place for a break. And we're going to take a short break to hear from our sponsors for AmericaOutloud.news. America Out Loud Talk Radio plays the 10 Penny Files on the iHeartRadio network at 3 p.m. daily, Monday through Friday, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. You can also listen anywhere in the world from America Out Loud's when you go to AmericaOutloud.news and log into their media player. You can also hear other great podcasters through that platform. If you've missed any of these great conversations that we've had, you can find the 10 Penny Files on Spotify, Pandora, Apple, TuneIn, iHeart Virtual Studio, and you just type in the 10 Penny Files up in the search bar. It'll take you right to these great conversations. We also have them on my platforms, which is dr10penny.com. If you go there and click on the podcast tab and drop down where it says all podcasts, you can find everything that we have recorded since we started this show. Also on my Substack at dr10penny.substack.com, because there are so many good books. Believe me, I'm reading 5 of them a week now. There are so many good books and documentaries out there. And for most people, so little time to read and watch. This show is meant to maximize your time and direct you to more resources that you can dig deeper into topics of your interest. Sit there for just a second, sit tight. We'll be right back with John Leake to talk more about his book, Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality, the story that tells the story of the technology and the celebrated men who were biased behind it. We will be right back. Zeolite is a detox spray We work specifically with a company called Touchstone Essentials. They are an incredible company. We've been working with them now for several years. And zeolite is a mineral that goes through your body like a one-way basket. It will clean out heavy metals such as arsenic and mercury, aluminum, cadmium, and it hooks onto those metals from a one-way perspective. So once it's bound, it goes out through your urine or your stools and doesn't get redeposited in other places. Everybody needs to have a detox product in their life, and this one is so easy to use and it's so safe. You can take it when you're pregnant, you can take it when you're nursing, you can give it to little children, you can even give it to infants, and quite frankly, I give it to my dog. I actually put a little bit of the zeolite in his water because until we all stop living in a toxic world, we all need to get some of those extra toxicities out. The heavy metals, the persistent organic pollutants, the things that are floating through the air, the different things that we come in touch with in our environment. And we are a big fan of zeolite from Touchstone Essentials. We've been a big fan of their products for several years. Go to drtenpenny.com/detox to get your first bottle of zeolite spray for $50 off.
Well, only when the government bows to the people will America become great again. This is Malcolm Out Loud here. Join me in pushing back against censorship, my fellow Americans. Right at the top of AmericaOutloud.news are the words: many voices, one freedom, united in the First Amendment. Now is our time, my fellow Americans. AmericaOutloud.news, liberty and justice for all.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Our conversation today is with nonfiction author who has a lifelong interest in medical history and forensic medicine, John Leake. Let me tell you a little bit more about today's guest. John studied history and philosophy with Sir Roger Scruton at Boston University. He then went to Vienna, Austria on a graduate school scholarship and ended up living there for over a decade, working as a freelance writer and a translator. In March of 2020, when SARS-CoV-2 started to spread to the United States, he perceived that the pandemic response was illogical at best and possibly criminal. In November of that year, he watched a video by Dr. Peter McCullough and saw his U.S. Senate testimony about early treatment. He made contact with Dr. Peter in Texas, where they both live, and together they wrote The Courage to Face COVID-19, their first book. Now, John, welcome back to the show. The subtitle of your book is Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, and Reality. What are the mythologies, ideologies, and realities of vaccines?
Well, the mythology is that the vaccine enterprise has always been strictly scientific, and proper methods of evaluating efficacy and safety, and that's just not true. I mean, if you go back to the early smallpox inoculation of the early 18th century, it was extremely crude. There was no real methods for controlling the procedure. And there was no real proper methods for ascertaining, did it really work? I mean, in other words, you make an incision on someone's arm, a healthy person's arm, you then take pus from the pustule of a sick person, you rub the pus in the wound on the healthy person's arm. The idea in theory is they will get a mild case of smallpox on the arm at the wound site, and then that will then forever protect them from smallpox should they ever be exposed. But if you read the literature on this, the only thing you can conclude is this may have worked with some people. It may have conferred some protection with some people. Other people died from the procedure. And then, of course, the question is those who did get a mild illness from the inoculation and lived to tell the tale, we don't know if they were ever really exposed to a virulent, smallpox again. There was no re-challenge, so to speak, that could enable us to evaluate this scientifically. So from the very beginning, we see there's a kind of charm in the idea, which is a charming idea, no, without a doubt. Just a little bit of poison will protect you from more severe illness. But this lack of proper scientific evaluation, there's wishful thinking, there's commercial motives, doctors who perform the early smallpox inoculation procedure. In the American colonies, they were charging about the equivalent of a full year's income for the average colonist. So there was a huge fortune behind becoming an inoculator. And of course, that creates an incentive to claim that it works and to ignore, sweep under the rug, overlook incidences in which it didn't. And one very poignant case, King George III and his wife Charlotta, they had a huge mess of kids, I think 15. And their last two children were these very pretty little boys, and there are royal portraits of them. They survived early infancy. Um, I think both reached the age of 4 or 5 years old. And in those days, if you got to 4 or 5, you were looking pretty good. George decided to get the inoculation procedure for both children. Both of them developed severe smallpox illness from the inoculation and both died. This was devastating for the parents. Apparently, as King George III slipped into madness, he kept having these recurring visions of these little boys that would visit him in his dreams. And it was just a horrifying thing. So, from the very beginning of the vaccine enterprise, there is this mythology that it was a strictly scientific enterprise, and it just wasn't. Um, so that's the mythology. The ideology is the way in which any other product, we have no problem with someone saying, well, can we evaluate it? Could we make it safer? Is it possible that in some instances it's not the best thing? If you ask those questions with vaccines, it's almost like you're committing an act of heresy. How dare you question the efficacy and the safety of this miraculous product that has saved millions of children from dying? And were it not for this product, measles would come roaring back in like a dragon, and we would have cemeteries overflowing with children. This is not a scientific way of thinking. This is an ideological adherence, an ideological way of thinking. And then the reality is, it would seem that some vaccines for some children, provided that they're properly manufactured and tested and the whole thing, do confer some protection, particularly when you look at the measles. I didn't get measles. Now, prior to 1963, all children got measles. I didn't. So measles morbidity was definitely reduced from the introduction of the measles vaccine. The question is, now that's on the table, is measles combined with mumps, rubella, tetanus, all these other vaccines, and we've seen the proliferation of the schedule. The question now, the reality now is, well, okay, there's certain rewards in vaccines, but what are the risks? Are there risks? Can we do a risk reward evaluation or a risk benefit evaluation? And now we're back into the frying pan of ideology. No, we're not going to talk about it. It's already been established. There's no scientific grounds for any skepticism. Well, so it's like, again, if it were any other product, we'd say, well, can we evaluate it critically? And no one would have a problem with that. It's only with vaccines. I think it's the only product where you're not allowed to question the safety and the efficacy.
It's interesting because Aaron Series' book, Vaccines Amen, I really loved that book. And
Great book.
it's knowing what I know, and I've been doing this for 25 years, reading that book just solidified everything that I've known, but put it into a perspective of everything about the vaccine industry is just myth. It's all a belief. That's why he named the book Vaccines Amen. It's a belief. And you got the high priest and you've got all of the apostles and the people that are following this based on literally nothing. And actually, I will say something to you when you said about the measles. The death from measles, the population-based death from measles was 2 in 2 million.
Oh, Sherry, I know. I just meant I never got it. I'm not doubting that the mortality.
And I'm just saying that, we could argue these points forever because I just don't see any value in any of them anywhere. And you actually say in your introduction that I'm a dangerous person for saying that. Not me personally, but you say in the introduction of your book that you are not anti-vaccine, and the anti-vaccine fanatics regard all vaccines equally dangerous and fraudulent without considering the possibility for certain people under certain circumstances that they may have a benefit that outweighs the risk. Therefore, both sides are fanatical. The pro-vaccine kinds are not. And I could kind of debate that with you, which I won't, but I would like to understand why you said that.
Well, I mean, I'm generally speaking, when you have any complex phenomenon, with any element of a touching on a complex system, I'm always just hesitant to to take an extreme on either side. There seems to have been in some vaccines, and I specifically mentioned the fact that I just never got measles. I don't think anyone of my generation got measles. So, and I'm not saying that suffering, a week of, a measles rash would have been a big deal. I did get chicken pox and it wasn't a big deal. So for me, I think there's great utility in considering, not how to put it, like having one's mind open to at least the possibility there's some utility in something. And I also, that was partly a rhetorical device as well, because I don't think we're going to get anywhere in terms of bringing this whole thing back down to reason if we just take the categorical dismissive idea that under no circumstances could any vaccine be of any utility? I don't think we're going to be very persuasive with that. I think that what we need to be talking about doing is, well, let's take a hard look at it. Let's have a conversation about it rather than a categorical out, ipso, or what am I trying to say? A, a categorical dismissal of the whole thing. It just doesn't seem, in terms of public discourse, a very like we're going to get very far with that. I think where we would win hearts and minds is if we could persuade people, well, let's just critically evaluate it.
Well, I think a lot of that is going on. There's a lot more studies, and Aaron Siri, did this thing with on Highwire with Del Bigtree, showing none of the vaccines actually has a placebo-controlled trial anywhere. It's always a vaccine against a vaccine, a vaccine.
Right.
And so, there was a big chart that he put together. So there's that kind of data that we're looking at. We're looking at, vaccinated versus unvaccinated populations who are healthier. Well, it appears so far of what is available, the unvaccinated people, and when we look at like the COVID shots, which is what your first book was about, and we look at all the tragic outcomes from that, all of the illness, the neurological problems, the turbo cancers, the cardiovascular things that Peter delves into, Dr. Pakula delves into a lot, all the kidney disorders and the kidney diseases, of what kind of tragedy that caused by, rushing out the gate. So I think that we really are getting to the place of maybe for the first time ever, John, really doing a critical evaluation about the ideology, like you point on your book. And I think the way you explained it was brilliant. I mean, it really does explain it very, very well about the myths and the ideologies and the problems that and the realities of what's really facing that. Let's switch over a little bit to talk about the COVID shots, because that was what your first book with Dr. McCullough was about. Is that why do you characterize the creators of the SARS-CoV-2 and the mRNA vaccines as an organized crime syndicate that you talk about that in your book?
I think the evidence is clear that with the passage of the PrEP Act in 2005, which granted liability protection and also couched within the act was not only granting liability protection to people producing, manufacturing so-called countermeasures. And those countermeasures, that's a term from military parlance. The PrEP Act was passed within the context of this idea of bioterrorism. That we'd had September the 11th, there was this anthrax letter attack a week later, which seems to have been carried out by somebody within U.S. biodefense. It wasn't Saddam Hussein; it was someone probably at Fort Detrick, our biodefense lab. But it didn't matter the reality of the anthrax letter attack, that it was actually a homegrown thing. Congress passed the PrEP Act. And in essence, what it states is another infectious disease pandemic is coming, or a bioterrorism attack like the anthrax letter attack, that's coming. And when it comes, anyone who is in the business of making so-called countermeasures, which includes vaccines, shall receive liability protection if anyone is harmed or killed from their product. And also, if it happens, it's clear that the US government is going to provide virtually unlimited funds pre-purchasing the countermeasure. So if you're a clever guy, an enterprising guy, and you hear that, wow, liability protection. And then Uncle Sam's going to come in with his checkbook and he's going to pre-purchase a gazillion dollars of the stuff. Well, let's get going and making another pandemic. I mean, like, what, we can't wait. Like, when's it coming? When's the next anthrax attack or whatever? And so, already you see this gain of function with influenza viruses. Kawaoka and Ron Fouchier, they start trying to figure out a way to make H5N1, which is an avian flu. How do we make it transmissible amongst humans? And, the implied is, well, then we can make vaccines against it should, God forbid, this virus ever circulate. I see this as being a criminal enterprise. And then the paper trail that SARS-CoV-2 was made in a lab with American biotechnology, primarily from Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina, that paper trail is so huge that, I joke in the book, it would take a New York Times reporter or a member of Congress not to see it. I mean, it's just enormous. So it's clear that they made the agent. It's basically a biowarfare agent, not so lethal that it will just kill huge percentages of the population, but it's a bioweapon in the sense that it will create chaos, uncertainty, that it will have the effect of debilitating the economy, of debilitation and disruption. And the idea is create the agent of biowarfare at the same time that you create a vaccine countermeasure against it. Should this agent ever get out of the lab, God forbid, we would never want that to happen. Well, we've got the vaccine that we can then use to vaccinate the entire public against it. So I think your audience, can catch the drift of where this is headed. And so that was my intuition. And then we come to the year 2022, and it was published in Frontiers in Virology, a Dutch group of molecular biologists. And they do a blast search, a genomic sequence search of this 19 nucleotide genetic sequence that's including the code that produces the spike protein in the so-called furin cleavage site of SARS-CoV-2, which is the key feature of the virus that makes it very, very infectious and transmissible amongst humans. They do a blast search for that 19 nucleotide sequence coding for the furin cleavage site, and they get a perfect match with a patented sequence patented by Stéphane Bancel at the Moderna Corporation in 2016.
Mm.
Perfect match. Perfect match. So doing standard biostatistical analysis, the chance of that happening randomly in nature is about 1 in 320 billion.
Wow.
So the question is, why did Bancel, why did Moderna, why did they have that sequence? Why did they patent it? It's the key sequence that makes SARS-CoV-2 infectious to humans. So just these like glaring things. I mean, remember, I'm coming out of a true crime background. It's like that needs to be investigated, but there is no investigation. There's none. Maria Baratiromo at Fox did an interview with Stefan Bancel, and she said, Stefan, can you explain like what is going on here? And he says, I will. He has this French accent. It's kind of charming. I will ask my scientists to look into it.
Very
I'll
cool.
ask them to look into it, and then no follow up,
No problem.
no attempt to pursue this.
Got about 1 minute left on the show here with us today.
Excuse me.
We could talk about this for hours and
Yeah.
hours. Any closing thoughts that you want to add to our audience in just like about 30 seconds?
The American people need to awaken to the reality of where we stand today with our living standards in terms of our vulnerability to infectious diseases. And we need to recognize that a vast industry has been created out of keeping us afraid and getting us in line for vaccines, not only for our children for endemic diseases, but also for the entire public with these so-called pandemic diseases, most of which I think are actually being made in biosecurity labs.
Amen to that. Well, listen, everybody, we've got to cut this short today because we've got so much to talk about. John and I, you and I could talk for another couple of hours, I know. But John's book, their most recent book out, Vaccines, Mythology, Ideology, Reality, that's the book. You can find it at bookstore.drtenpenny.com. And I'm so grateful to have him here today. I'm grateful for all of your listeners who are here. We will see you again on the Tenpenny Files tomorrow or the next time at 3 p.m. Eastern right here on AmericaOutloud.news, iHeartRadio, or on our website at drtenpenny.com. Please follow me on X at BusyDrT. Have a great rest of your day, everybody. We'll see you the next time on the Tenpenny Files. Goodbye and God bless.